Hello and good afternoon or good morning, based on your time zone. Welcome to today's featured webinar, 3 Ultimate Strategies for Ransomware Protection. We've got a great sized crowd online here and a great topic for you today. My name is Rick Vanover, Senior Director of Product Strategy here at Veeam, and I'll be your presenter today. And I'm joined by Natalie from our global marketing team. She's going to help out with questions. So let's go ahead and first of all, let's start with a few administrative points about the webinar. Now, if you've not used GoToWebinar before, I'll give you a quick rundown. First of all attendees were muted upon entry, which is kind of necessary. I've got like a couple hundred that are going to join. But that doesn't mean you can't interact with us during the webinar. So if you use the GoToWebinar questions pane, I'm going to do my best to answer that question. In fact, we have dedicated time at the end of the webinar to go over your questions. Now, if I can spot one that comes in as we're going on, I'll do my best, but I'll see what I can do. And then the other thing to note is that because this webinar is recorded, we will post this recording on the website at veeam.com/videos. And then we're also going to have a copy of the slides available as well after the email or after the webinar concludes. So the Q&A panel will be our friend if you have a question, and I'll do my best to go through all of those. But let's go, before we get into the ransomware tips, I just want to do a quick introduction of Veeam. Hopefully you've all heard of us, but if not, one thing I want you to know is that as we go through time, what you will enjoy with Veeam is constant innovation of the backup products. We work really hard to be the leader of backup solutions that are in the market that are delivering cloud data management. And we really want to focus on backup and be a trusted provider as such. So we want to always have new capabilities in the mix that are going to respond to your environment as the environment changes and such. We just came off of the version 10 release last month, a huge release, over 150 new and enhanced capabilities. There's one of them I'm going to talk about at length here today, but you can find more information about V10 on the website. Also introducing us again, if you don't know, we kind of look at the capabilities building up from an API standpoint to provide the fundamental promise of our products, providing backup and recovery, replication and failover. And then we build up on that with orchestration to take what we're doing from a backup perspective and orchestrate that for DR, orchestrate that from replication standpoint, or even just deploying Veeam. In fact, I'll get to that here in a second. If you're fancying the infrastructure as code practice, it's quite popular today. And then the other side of that is monitoring and analytics, good visibility into what's going on, what I like to say the finer points of a backup implementation. And we really target the cloud, the SaaS, the virtual, and the physical parts of your data center and IT practice to be that most trusted provider of backup solutions. Now, in order to get that done, we kind of have to look through a platform or an ecosystem of partners. I've liked to say over the years that I've been saying that Veeam has partnerships in our DNA. And I think that's very visible here. All of the solutions up here, double checking, yeah, all of these we integrate with. And when it comes to beating ransomware, you care about the data you have up here. You care about your data on premises as a virtual or a physical machine. You care about your workloads in the cloud. You care about your email data. And then how we get that done from a backup and recovery and a replication failover perspective to keep your data safe from the current threatscape is we have some secret weapons with some of the integrations that we're going to talk about a few of those today. And then there's a huge category of opportunity here in the public cloud, and we'll talk through that as well. But the thought here is when you look at our platform, where we integrate with, chances are these are a lot of the same technologies that you use in your environment. And speaking of your environment, we put at the center of it all your data. And when we refer to your data, I'm referring to the data your business cares about, whether it lives in the private cloud or in the public cloud. You have the capability with Veeam to enjoy 5 key sets of capabilities. people come to us for backup and recovery, but there also are use cases around mobilizing data to the cloud or providing monitoring and analytics of the environment you have. We can also talk about orchestration and automation of Veeam and other things, and then have a good sense of security in regards to the governance and compliance aspects of your deployment. Again, people come to us for this backup and recovery promise, but as you walk through the wheel of capabilities here, this bottom half becomes the finer points to really do more with your backup environment. So hopefully that's a quick and good enough intro, but let's now transition to the ransomware topic. So the first thing I want to highlight here is that there have been a lot of changes to backup over the years. I've spent the last 10 years of my professional career focused exclusively on this topic. I came from a background of system, server, storage, administration before that. But if we look in two categories, both non-technical and technical changes over the years, there's really been a lot. And when it comes to being resilient against ransomware, I actually want to gravitate to the top two non-technical ones. You know, digital transformation indeed is a buzzword. But the reality is, because our businesses are so transformed now, that risk of ransomware is really, really high. Keep that in consideration with SLA and stakeholder expectations. And I think that this should be an and, but a lot of organizations might have a versus, all right? So there's almost an adversarial relationship of the business expects a very high service level, but the backup implementation is much lower, right? That's basically what we call at Veeam a gap, an availability gap, right? So there's some non-technical things that are going on here, but then also business resiliency requirements, right? Everybody's expecting very high service levels and backup windows, you know, kind of hard to come by these days, right? So we have challenges in how we're wanting to protect everything with these non-technical factors, but also virtualization platforms, clouds, storage transitions, and this is actually probably one of the more impactful to ransomware. When I grew up doing backups, now I don't want to sound like a grumpy old man, but maybe I am. But when I grew up, it was disk to tape, and that was it, right? But now organizations are doing disk to tape, or disk to cloud, or disk to cloud and tape, or something like that. You know, depends on how many levels of copies you want and where you want to keep it. And we also are all dealing with larger amounts of data. There's also storage efficiencies and storage platform enhancements that come into play, but there's just so much going on in regards to backups that has been directly correlated to what's happening in the production data. But in the end, kind of when I talked about what we put at the center focus, it's your data, right? So your data, whether it's in the private cloud or in a public cloud, that's what we care about. But the reality is, with some of the threats today, ransomware can compromise that. And that's the challenge that we have here today that I want to prepare you for. You know, overnight, if any of you have been in a ransomware situation, your life has changed from an IT professional perspective. Whenever I give this presentation in person, I always ask for a show of hands. Hey, how many of you have been in a ransomware situation? Any type. Would you believe that about half of the people raise their hand? That's absolutely shocking. That first of all, just in a public forum, they'd admit it and raise their hand. Now I don't like, you know, take, you know, attendance and then go, you know, talk to them or anything. It's just, you know, at a VMware event, at a Veeam event, I've done that, security events, and just a show of hands, it's really shocking. For those of you who, you know, would not be raising your hand, the reality is it's not an if, it's a when. So my goal here is to prepare you for what I'm going to call my 3 ultimate strategies here for resiliency against ransomware. So those strategies are actually 3 specific categories of recommendations. Now, each one of these I'm going to build out with more technical configuration. So there's a lot of links that I'm going to be sharing. The good news is we're going to send I believe we send an email with a link to download the slides. If not, you can bug me on Twitter and I'll get it for you. But the tips really are around education of users and administrators. right? We can't blame all of this on the users anymore. And I'm only saying that based on some data that I have from people who are dealing with ransomware. The second category are backup and recovery implementations. How you implement Veeam will be very critical to how you survive a ransomware situation. So let me give you a parallel. And this is the North American webinar, so this will make a little bit more sense. This was harder to tell in the EMEA and APJ one. Imagine if you're going through an audit, if you're subject to HIPAA or PCI, right? A lot of times people ask me, hey, Rick, is Veeam PCI compliant? Is Veeam HIPAA compliant? And I don't want to say I laugh, but I kind of snicker because I used to work in financial services, right? And I know the answer to this question. A product is not necessarily compliant out of the box. What makes it compliant? It's how it's implemented and how it's audited. I want to take the same logic to being resilient against ransomware. How is the backup product implemented and what is the nature of the exploit? It's kind of the same thing, right? I'm going to get the specific recommendations on that in a moment. And then there's your remediation plan or plans. Those are the ways you can address this. And I would actually think you could potentially work some of these in different times. And what I mean by that is kind of continually be working on education. Think about the remediation plan, right? Like, what do you do? Have a plan for that. And then always be diligent around the implementation. These three are a revolving circle of mindsets. So let's get into some specifics. The first one I'm going to start with is education. And the reason I want to start with the education on this is actually comes right out of our support team. So I don't know if you've ever had to call for support for a ransomware situation at Veeam or elsewhere, but Tim, who's in the office with me, he leads our SWAT team, we call it. Now, SWAT is a service level that's a very high priority case. That's where our ransomware cases go. They go straight to SWAT. They kind of leap over tier one, and it's kind of a very critical type of case because it's a very dangerous situation. If ransomware is involved, the last thing we want to have happen is to compromise the integrity of the backups. But take a read at what Tim's advice is. What sticks out to me is education. And he sees this every day from the support management perspective. And I like this at the bottom. Just having the admin informed is not enough. Honestly, users need to have mortal fear put into them. And that sounds a little harsh, but if you think about the risks of completely losing the business, it actually isn't that harsh at all. And I think it should be both the users and administrators. And this will work together. Again, education coupled with implementation, coupled with remediation. They all end in ION. Just now noticed that. But anyways, so when we look at this kind of a simple example, right? We've all seen these junk emails that when you look a little closer at the actual sender of the emails, it's like, well, that's not really Amazon. Or if you get a piece of behavior that actually isn't the case, that's true. I mean, it almost might seem like, oh no, someone's trying to get into my account. I gotta go change my password or something. So I'll click on these things, right? And it's a phish, right? This is one type of attack. This is by no means the only way ransomware gets in, but this is one kind of common one that we may see often. And the funny thing is like sometimes they're kind of good and crafty, and sometimes they're just not. I get these all the time, especially in my personal email, right? And I'm sure we've all seen these, but this is a good start. But the reality is you have to, as an IT pro, my expectation is you have a good sense of what is or is not legitimate, but you can't think the same for your user base. So that leads me to a specific recommendation. So I recommend that, especially for the phish risk, that you consider simulating the risk of phishing success. Now, what I mean by that is there's two tools that have been referred to me by some of the vanguards. One is called KnowBe4, and the other one is called GoPhish. That is open source, by the way. Go Fish. It's free, so you can uh, you can use that without any cost. And then KnowBe4, I think, is a paid service. But a lot of times I find that security teams will use these services. And the reality is that if you're a one-person IT shop, you might want to think about doing this. But what they do is they'll simulate phish emails. And you can get creative, like, putting in names of key people in your company to make it look like it came from them. And if they actually bite on these emails, or you can get reports of who actually opened the links, for example, who actually read the email. And that'll give you a very good kind of target area to know who may be a candidate for additional knowledge training on what is or is not an appropriate way to use email. So I think that's a really good prevention tool, right, for the masses. And I've been through these types of trainings as a member at Veeam, right? And yeah, I get it, but I do give it my attention, right? And I don't know if Veeam does this internally, but I've not been told, hey, Rick, you're a candidate for more training. So at least I'm so far so good. And the other thing I would recommend is checking out some of the government resources around ransomware. Officially it's a crime, so it's one of those things that the government puts out some tips and some information about current threats so that you can potentially work this into the education, implementation, and remediation cycle. And I think that the threat is real. Again, the SWAT team helps Veeam customers out with this area every day. But in 2017, there was a ransomware, the Samus one, that was aware of the Veeam backup format. So it went out and encrypted and deleted, maybe just encrypted. Well, it looks like it said it deleted it, but either way, put the backup infrastructure at risk, right? So the threat is very serious. And if you think about impacting your backup infrastructure, that becomes quite scary. So that's where some of the tips need to come into play. And so before I transition into implementation advice, I really want to go in with a mindset. I recommend a layered defense. And what I mean by that is multiple ways to be resilient against ransomware, because I do believe there's really not a single magic bullet here. There's some really strong techniques that I'm going to get to here in a second, but I really recommend a layered defense just due to the threatscape and the risks involved. So let me break through those real quick in the form of backup and recovery implementations. Now, this is going to apply almost exclusively to Veeam, but if you're using an additional product, you probably can take some of this knowledge and apply it to what you're doing as well. But it would just be easier to use Veeam, but hey. So the first thing I want to highlight is kind of an early edge on the implementation. And there's two things. One is detection, right? So I don't know if you're using Veeam 1, but Veeam 1 has an alarm for possible ransomware activity. Now, possible ransomware activity is a kind of a determined characteristic. Basically, it's seen high write rates on disk along with high CPU, right? That's one characteristic of some of the encrypting types of ransomware, especially if it's traversing a lot of files, right? So that is an alarm that can be triggered, and this applies to both VMware and Hyper-V. Don't think it's just a Hyper-V type of alarm. So I recommend, if you're not using Veeam 1, use it. And if you are using Veeam 1, put a high level of notification on this alarm. So page me, right? Or text me or something like that. Email the security team. You could go so far as to shut down the VM. That's pretty aggressive, but that might be something, whatever you can think about, but there are some actions you can put in place if this alarm is detected. If you have a development cluster, you could maybe scope it in there, and that might be an interesting angle, right? If there's a development system, which might be an area where this type of risk may be higher, that might be a good candidate to put in that type of automated action. And the other thing I want to highlight came with version 10 that came out last month. There's a new alarm from a backup side called suspicious increment. And the thought here is, wow, that incremental backup is really, really big. And I can think of a few use cases where that is actually legitimate, and mainly it's around, I built a new SQL server, and I'm backing it up, and then I hand it over to the DBA, and they, through a whole bunch of scripts, deploy a whole bunch of backup files or database files, right? And they populate out and move databases over. That might be an example, but it at least is something that you would have as an early detection element. So here's two angles that Veeam Technologies can help you there. And my next recommendation is around backup storage. And I'm actually going to have a lot of recommendations around backup storage because, well, that's where the backups are kept. And if you have a ransomware situation, I'm convinced there's only one course of action. That's being able to restore. The other courses of action, such as conscious loss of data or paying the ransom, those are, you don't want to go there, right? And even removing it is kind of janky. The only real way out is to restore. So my recommendation is to keep the enemy guessing. And this is an area where if you have different file systems in place, you have one layer of abstraction to kind of give you some resiliency against propagation. So in particular, the data domains and the store onces, those dedupe appliances here, these two actually communicate through a special set of libraries that is not over traditional protocols like SMB, NFS, etc. In fact, the data domain, you can even move data fiber channel only, no network at all, right? So that's an interesting level of resiliency. I'm not saying you need to go out and buy these things, but I'm just saying if you have these, consider using Boost, consider using Store Once, Catalyst. The Exagrid, for example, we have a native data mover process over Linux that does a lot of manipulations directly on the appliance. And again, that limits the traditional protocol access, right? So that's a way to kind of not expose the backups to the massive amounts of the network. And we're going to get to that here in a second. And then here's one that actually doesn't incur much additional cost at all, and that's Linux backups on a general purpose disk system. And one angle you can take here is just putting one small set of recovery points on a different file system. So you can make a repository on a Linux server or even on an XFS file system and enjoy some storage efficiencies with Veeam. And the thought here is that that's a completely different authentication construct, completely different location possibly. You could put a copy of data on a different set of storage, which is different than the Windows deployment that Veeam might live in. And that's kind of a setup to the 3-2-1 rule, right? We've been talking about the 3-2-1 rule here at Veeam for a very long time. But even in the ransomware era, I think it absolutely is still something to think about. And really the one that matters is this one, don't forget your offline copy. Having 3 different copies of media on 3 different copies of data on 2 different media, with one of which being off-site, is a very resilient way to store your data. And if we think about an offline, or I'm going to introduce a term to you called ultra resilient, if you think about using that, you're going to be in a really good spot. So that's my term, ultra resilient backup. So here's the thing here. I'm taking credit for this. I made up this word, ultra resilient state. Some form of a backup, some form of your backup data being in an ultra resilient state. I'm actually convinced if there's one single recommendation, well, it's really tough to put one, but okay, yeah, if I had the chance to do any single recommendation of what I'm talking about today, this would probably be it. Something that's ultra resilient. So an ultra resilient backup, and I'll get to the topics here in a second, but generally it's either offline, it's immutable, or it's air gapped. These particular types of backups are going to be very efficient in being resilient against ransomware. But I also need you to kind of think about, well, how long do I need to take it, right? Do I want to take it for 7 days? Do I want to have 1 month? Do I want to have 1 year of data in this state? That becomes a risk calculation. And the reason why I say that, because I can't provide a specific answer, maybe even more than a year, But the reason why is that some ransomware like to dwell a little bit. They like to sit on data for a bit. So the thought is potentially even with an ultra resilient backup type, you could reintroduce the threat. But the good news is with Veeam, you could actually reintroduce just file data. You don't necessarily have to always do full image-based backup restores. In fact, I spoke to one organization one time who had something like that, and they restored the image from about a year ago, but then they restored the actual file data that they cared about from like 2 days ago or a day ago or something much more recent, right? So that can be a way around some of these problems. And I'm going to get to the multiple restore types, part of the remediation angle, but something to think about. And when you think about these ultra resilient backup types, I kind of also want you to think about how you could achieve that. And I'll get to the list of those in a second. But when you think about, okay, if I did have a ransomware situation and I'm trying to set up something I'm bringing up here later in the webinar, but what do you do if you do have a situation? If you do have an outbreak, right? A lot of times that's something people haven't thought about. If it starts to show up, what do you do? Now, I spend a lot of time listening to people who have gone through it. And it's very interesting, right? We've all been there, all hands, everybody fix an outage. That's different. Ransomware really is spooky because every single move you make may be the last move you make on a system. So get your mind around who do you call for help? And you can also think about Veeam because how we access the backups to do a restore can be very important. We want to make sure that the backups are in a good state. What are your options? So I did mention that notion of I might pull back an image-based backup from a year ago, but the file backup from last night, right? One or more recovery options may be part of the resolution. So give some thought to all of your ways out of a problem. And then also keep in mind Veeam Secure Restore. If you're not familiar with that, what it does is it will restore data, either image-based backup or even just virtual disks or files, and it'll scan it with the latest version of the antivirus tool on the Veeam infrastructure, which is kind of important if you have a newer definition, but B, potentially a different tool in the mix. So, implementation. This is one of the things I was bringing up again and again. And I went back and forth between what's my single most effective recommendation, and the ultra resilient backup target would be probably the most important. But when it comes to implementing Veeam, we've actually, in my opinion, done a very good job of documenting the required permissions, the ports, etc., system requirements. And I encourage you to use this information to actually implement a permission model of assigning the least privilege for the Veeam accounts. So let me flip this around the other way. The worst practice would be to have Veeam installed and running as domain administrator, the username called administrator, which is also the same administrator access for everything else. That account, should it be compromised, becomes an incredible conduit of propagation, right? It's got access to everything, including the backups. I wrote a white paper about this, and I have a link to it at the end of the webinar. But what I'm recommending is actually using completely separate accounts. And if you can do it, put it on a separate administrative domain or even just work group accounts, right? No domain access at all. One important tip there though, do not use the same template password. And what I mean by that is if I have templates in my VMware environment, in my Hyper-V environment as well. If I deploy a template from there, there's a username that's the same. If I'm going to do it for something like a production Veeam backup implementation, I should probably change that default password as well. May or may not put it on a domain, but the thought is more abstraction coupled with these documented requirements can really help you. And then the components, right? Now I realize I've looked at the list of people attending. I know some of you, so welcome. But the components are a topic. And what I mean by that is actually today I'm working from home. And in my in my closet in my office, I have a small server, right? I think it has 4 or 5 virtual machines on it. Nothing much, but you might think, oh, well, home lab, right? Well, actually, no, it's more than that because my wife and I, we have a nanny, a legal household here. We have an employer identification number. I have payroll data that I care about. So I'm basically functioning as a small business here at home. I need to keep that data secure. Now I'm following a lot of these recommendations I'm going through, namely the ultra resilient backup target. But for my Veeam deployment, I have one virtual machine that runs Veeam, and all of these roles are stacked on it. And that's okay for that. The only exception is the ultra resilient backup type is an additional repository. So there's multiple copies, at least that's what I'm doing at home. But granted, not everybody on this call is running this type of thing in their basement. So when you look at the components, this is actually what my Veeam deployment at home looks like. It's all one virtual machine. The only exception is I have multiple repositories. So I have one that's directly attached, and then I have one that's ultra resilient because it's an offline hard drive. But the reality is each of these components can be decoupled. So let me flip this to being a production data center. I can pull console access off and get into it remotely. In fact, I do that all the time in the Veeam lab. I can also have the database not connected or not on the same system as the Veeam server. Sometimes you have to do that for scale reasons also. And each of these can have their own security context. The proxies are the data movers that perform file and VMware and Hyper-V backups. Those are separate components as well. And then the one piece that matters the most is the repository. And each of these can kind of have their own security context to log into the repository, or to log into the database, or to log into the console itself. The reality is the best recipe for your components does depend. Now, what I'm not recommending is to simply take apart what you've already built and redesign it like this. No. What I am recommending is if you make one change, make it around your repository. Take the documentation of the least required permissions and then go from there, as well as some of the other tips that I have coming up, especially if you've already deployed. If you're thinking about a new Veeam deployment, think about distributing the components as it makes sense. But if you make one change, make it around the security to your backup repository. And I double down on that and say, don't let the masses of the business be able to browse your backup repository. Sounds a little bit obvious, but even if people don't know what it is, if they find it, deleting it or reading it, taking it home and opening it up, that's not the business we want to get into, right? So if you make one kind of change, make it around the repository. Now, this is not what's running in my basement, but to kind of put this on a bigger scale here, if we have this looks like it's 6 VMware or Hyper-V hosts, right? And then we're connecting to VMware vCenter, and we have Veeam backup and replication involved here. Number one, think of all these ways of communication. So we want to make sure that each of these communication channels have the explicit amount of permissions they need, and putting the most amount of protection around the area number 3 here. That is where our backups live, and it's really important to note. I'll share you an example a couple of times over, but imagine that this is a Hyper-V deployment, and instead of vCenter, let's say it was System Center, Virtual Machine Manager. I had a colleague of mine up in Canada, basically everything got bricked. And when I say bricked, I mean bricked. They had the Hyper-V servers powered onto the encryption screen, and the NAS devices were bricked. The only thing that saved them was they had a backup in Azure. And I'll get to that a little bit more in a second. So I can't emphasize enough having the backups repositories secured. The good news here is that the backups we put in a backup repository, and this also applies to the cloud, they are what I call a self-describing data format. And what I mean by that is you can simply import your backups and go. What I mean by that is in that organization where the entire on-premises infrastructure was gone, what my colleagues did was deploy a new Veeam server, add the bucket, or in this case, an Azure Blob container, import the backups and start restoring. It can be that easy. And that's where I want you to kind of put your head around. But I actually have a new recommendation. Um, it's around encryption. I used to only recommend encrypting backups if they the went from like the main site to a second site, or if the backups went on a tape. But I'm actually now recommending every backup be encrypted. So anything on a tape, any backup on disk, any copy job, any log job. And the logic here is that there's a new ransomware out there called Robinhood. And Robinhood, what it's doing is it's actually more of a exploit than it is an encryptor. So it's kind of funny. I'm going to use encryption to help beat ransomware, but in this particular ransomware, Robinhood, what they like to do is they like to take files up, and the ransom is to prevent a leak. So what I mean is I hope that they wouldn't leak your backups or open up your backups and then leak everything that's in them, because honestly, that would be a much more significant target than, if they found access to one SQL database, right? Let me just take the backup with the whole lot of it. So my logic here is let's encrypt the backups. So if that gets exploited, it won't be a complete leak. And that's like I said, that's the Robinhood ransomware I've been seeing. And one way to prevent that additionally and help with other risks is no internet for the backup infrastructure. So I'm really kind of gravitating hard on this of not providing internet access to the Veeam BNR server. And this could help prohibit the introduction of ransomware or uploading. And it doesn't take much. And what I mean by that is consider if I log into the Veeam server with internet access, and I'll just log into my, webmail or my single sign-on, or I have to get something out of my personal email, or I have to get something out of my work email, and I'll do it on the Veeam server while I'm remote desktoped in, for example. And I might open up the webmail client and I click something wrong, download something, or worst case, I leave it open and I start looking at other things, going to other things on the internet, looking up an error message. You can easily end up in the wrong place of the internet real easily. And I would absolutely not want that to happen on my Veeam server. So the thought here, just don't provide internet access at all. Now, if you're going to use cloud backups, whether it's a service provider or the public object storage, we need to put some shaping into place. And I recommend that shaping go two different directions. From the Veeam single role that's going to put the backup data into the cloud, and then where is that target? So example, this one IP, which is the gateway server in Veeam Talk, to the Azure, for example, and then on Azure, put in a firewall rule. Here's, for example, I blurred it out, but here's some IP addresses in my Azure firewall rule that says I can only accept traffic inbound to this Azure blob container from these IPs. Likewise, the components from Veeam that I want to send up to Azure, only this particular component out of 4 components, this particular IP, can only go to this part of the internet, something like that. It sounds a little bit arcane, but it's actually very important, and I recommend you do something like this. But beyond the design, the number one shortcoming is that lack of air-gapped or ultra-resilient backup storage. And I think that is important because every time I talk to customers that are fighting ransomware, they're using kind of everything I'm telling you not to do, right? They're using the same account for everything, 2 different disk systems, not 3 that are involved, nothing off-site, nothing offline, nothing air-gapped, nothing immutable. My logic here is that the air-gapped or the ultra-resilient storages are going to be the single most efficient and effective technique to be resilient. So I recommend at least 1 copy, not necessarily the whole lot and the whole length of your retention, but at least 1 copy in the ultra-resilient family. Now, it could be the most recent backup. And I'll tell you an example. This came out of the Veeam forums. An organization was committed, to disk-based backups, great. But what they had done was they decided, well, we're going to keep our tape environment around, first of all, because we have it. But second of all, we're going to keep it just because it has the air gap and it's rather resilient against ransomware. But what they did with it was really interesting. They only kept 7 days of backups on tape. Now, I usually think about tape and I'm thinking about, oh, 7 years, 10 years, forever, or something like that. Whether it's the worm option, which is write once, read many media, or just simply a tape media rotation of 7 days, that's an interesting angle. So whether it's tape or these ultra resilient types, these are ways that you can do this. So I have 6 areas here that are ultra resilient, or more specifically, offline, immutable, and air gapped. And these 3, tape, rotating hard drives, and immutable backups, these 3 in the brighter green color, these are my most ultra resilient recommendations. And I'll go through each of these real quick. I'm not necessarily saying do all 6 of these. In fact, that would be kind of a lot. But what I am suggesting is have at least 1 in the light green category and maybe 1 in this other green category. Tape media, rotating drives, and immutable backups are going to be the most resilient specimens. So tape is, like we all know, it's completely offline unless it's being read from or written to. Rotating hard drives, that's what I do here at the house. I have hard drives that come on and offline and move around. And when they're not being read from or written to, they're offline. I've spoken to a number of customers who kind of take a riff on this one here. And I'm by no means an expert in networking, but they've had some NAS devices that are, just on the network, powered on. But what they've done is for those network ports, that is that NAS device, they've put in service hours, like it's only online a certain amount of time, and it's only just to receive the backups. And then they've even orchestrated like a snapshot of that NAS device itself. So kind of some interesting tricks you can do with that. I mean, I've even heard of people using these smart plugs, like I forget the name of them, but they're like a Wi-Fi connected power supply that you turn something on and off explicitly for the backup window. You can put all that together with some scripting and automation to kind of get an offline or an air gapped target that's a disk system or a NAS device. And then the big one, this is the new one, immutable backups. I'm going to talk about this one in particular here in a second, but this is an opportunity to have basically a digital air gap in that I'm going to put backup into S3 with the object lock mode, or object lock with compliance mode for Veeam backups to go into the cloud. And that would be immutable, meaning I cannot delete it for a specified number of days. So whether it's ransomware, an accidental deletion, maybe a malicious administrator, that backup data cannot go away. And that's probably, honestly, this is probably the strongest of these. Because if you include ransomware with the threat of a malicious administrator and the threat of possible accidental deletion, I could actually argue that's stronger than all 3 of these combined, with the exception of Cloud Connect, which I'll get to here in a second. Because I could, as a malicious administrator, destroy tape media or destroy tape drive. I could destroy the rotating hard drive, but I cannot delete that data in the cloud. It sounds crazy, but we kind of have to think about more than just ransomware. The malicious administrator, accidental deletion use case is a thought as well. And then these 3, replicated virtual machines, primary storage snapshots, and Cloud Connect backups, those are also additional resiliency techniques. And Cloud Connect, which is a backup storage in the sky, lack of a better word, that's a technique where you can have backup storage as a service hosted by a Veeam cloud and service provider. And many of those providers offer something called insider protection, which is a separate copy of your backup data out of band from a different administration realm as well. So, but in all cases, getting backups into Cloud Connect is using a different API and a different type of connectivity from, it's not exposed to CIFS, it's not exposed as SMB or NFS. it's an application type of consumption. Storage snapshots, if you have a Veeam integrated array, this is a great way to have one extra level of recovery. But I'd also go so far as to say, and you might have caught my recommendation when I was talking about the organization who had a NAS device behind a network port that had very limited service hours. If your backup target supports storage snapshots, that might be a good thing to set up if you know how to do it. Now, we don't have a Veeam Explorer for backup repositories from a snapshot, but the thought is if you have one more way to recover your backup storage, that might be really powerful. And then replication. This is an interesting one as well, because usually replicated VMs are basically a disaster play. Well, if you know anything about ransomware, it very well may be a disaster. So keep that in mind as a way out as well. So I mentioned I'm going to explain the cloud tier and the immutable backups a little bit more, because again, I think this is the single technology of all of those that are probably the most resilient. Again, I want multiple ones to be used. I want the required permissions to be set right, et cetera. But in order to explain the cloud tier and the immutable backups, I almost have to back into explaining this thing, the SOBR, the scale out backup repository. So before I can kind of explain how data gets thrown up into the cloud, I got to kind of work backwards a little bit. So especially if you're thinking about on-premises with direct attached storage, network attached storage, and potentially dedupe appliances, what Veeam can do through the scale out backup repository is actually aggregate all three of those storage resources to one logical construct called the performance tier. Now, this is basically a pool or a collection of your backup storage systems, completely independent, right? And completely software defined and hardware agnostic. I mean, basically any storage protocol we can aggregate up here. And then all of your backups point to this logical target. The backup data may live here, it may live here, and it might even also potentially live in a third place or be spread across. You have a policy to set, well, I want to keep things together, or I could use the policy to put full backups down here for storage efficiency, for example, or I could put something like incremental backups on these two devices due to performance reasons. You have a really good policy engine here. Okay, great. That's been out for, I want to say since version 7, maybe version 8, can't remember. It's been a while. But the thought here is that is a logical construct. And in late 2018, we introduced support for putting that backup data into the cloud. And that was through something we called move mode. And so the logic here is if I want to keep a year of backup data on the performance tier, I had the option to offload some of that to the cloud. Like if my overall retention was to keep 10 years of data, I could keep 1 year on this performance tier and then automatically keep the years 2 through 10 in the cloud. And I could also make it much more granular. I could say keep 1 week of data on premises if I only need a year, and keep 9 years and 51 weeks in the cloud, for example, because the cloud is effectively infinite. That's what we had with a move mode, and the move is very efficient, very transparent to do that. But what we did in version 10 was double down on the cloud. So oldest backups being moved is where we started, with this technology being cloud ready. And last month, we implemented with version 10, the immediate copy. So the thought here, let's take the 10-year retention. The moment a backup is written here, so day 1, and I have 10 years of retention, let's say, immediately when day 1's backup is written, it's sent immediately to the cloud in the form of a copy. Now that is different than the move, because what would happen before is after that week, for example, that data would be evacuated from the performance tier and put exclusively in the cloud. But now with move mode combined with copy mode, I can have the first set of backups, say day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, they can sit on the performance tier and in the capacity tier or the cloud tier at the same time. And the important thing to note here is the second bullet point. It's completely transparent and policy based. You're actually just given a question. How much data do you want to retain on-prem? How much do you want in the cloud? Boom, done, sorted. What's determined in the cloud is actually based on the backup job. So if you say, I want to restore or retain this for 2 years, 10 years, that's set in a backup job, and the performance tier will just act that out for you. The scale out backup repository will act that out for you. So the copy mode, again, taking a backup and immediately copying it to the cloud, used in conjunction with immutability, becomes the next new thing. Now, the immutability capability exists on the public Amazon S3, but some of the S3 compatible storage systems as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to go to the hyperscale public cloud. And I recommend, if you investigate the immutability along with the immediate copy, you use those together. Because otherwise, if I write something into an immutability bucket with only move mode, it might be too old, right? So again, think about that first diagram where I had the, incident and how far back do you want to go with an ultra resilient backup? Because most of the time people want to start with their most recent restore points. And if copy mode is put that into the cloud with immutability, that gives me a very resilient way to start seeing that data come back on-prem. And the other things to note is that these are space efficient. So there is a storage efficiency in moving backup data to the cloud. It's self-sufficient. So you remember I said I had a colleague in Canada that everything was bricked. All they had was data in an Azure blob storage container. They were able to import that, drop in their encryption key, and restore everything. Nothing to the left of this blob container was available. So no scale-out backup repository was available, no Hyper-V, no VMware, no Windows, nothing. They started with just backups in the cloud. And the also kind of rather important differentiator here is actually, I believe everything I'm talking about here is free. If you are using Veeam at the universal license, all of this is included, and there's no cloud costs for this. So there's no extra cost to do this. And I recommend using this immutability. Okay, lot to think in, but now the remediation plan. And that actually poses a question. Do you have a plan? Have you given thought about what to do if something like this happens? I recommend having kind of a loose plan about who do you call, your vendor support, including Veeam support. Be familiar with your different types of restores. Maybe have service providers set up already for disaster recovery as a service. Be familiar with the Veeam Secure Restore engine, right? Think about isolation. That's, one, a lot of times people just start turning off network switches or unhooking things from the network. Give some thought to it, right? If you haven't done that, it's probably an interesting drill, because otherwise you might start to fix something and then another instance of the problem will happen. And I have a new recommendation as well. And this is around, if your environment is completely bricked, what do you do? And I've seen a lot of interest around automation, but I think you could also use this in a recovery situation. So I, by no means, am an expert in infrastructure as code, but a couple of people on my team are. But there's a lot of Veeam resources out on GitHub. There's a lot of Veeam resources on Terraform, Chocolatey, and Ansible, so that you can have automated ways to deploy Veeam, but also think about deploying your infrastructure. So I mentioned the Hyper-V cluster example where everything was bricked. Wouldn't it be great if they could automatically redeploy Hyper-V or automatically redeploy VMware and deploy the Veeam infrastructure to then import those backups and do restores? Yeah, you can import via your laptop, but if you have skill around these automation tool sets, this may actually help you in a doomsday scenario. Michael Cade on my team has actually done a lot of good blogging around this. And so a lot of information here, but one thing I want to highlight is I have a paper and I'm getting ready to update it, but there's a lot of papers in the ransomware series papers here This is a content library of some configurations and other resources that are on the website that you can read and help implement for your backup deployment. The thought here is that this is a chess game that I want to play, and I want to give you the tools to win. I'm hoping by the end of the month I have my updated ransomware paper based on V10 and a couple other new pieces of advice, but hopefully this information has been helpful for you. So let's go ahead and switch over to questions. So I've got a few questions here. Thank you, Eric. Appreciate it. Eric seemed to like the content. If you have a question, go ahead and drop it in the GoToWebinar screen. We'll do what we can to give you an answer. Water IT asks, will that work for 7 terabytes of data? Sure. I can tell you, Water IT, I can't give you the official number because it's NDA from the clouds, but we have had plenty of data go up into the hyperscale public clouds. Jesus asks, where is the suspicious increment? Well, it's part of V10, but it would be in backup and replication and or Veeam 1. I probably need to simulate that. Good question there, Jesus. Eric asks, is there a version of the agent that would run on Linux or just source code? The Veeam agent for Linux supports all major distros, but I just go on the page. I believe every distro you mentioned there, it's supported. Eric goes on to ask, what Linux file system is best recommended for backups? Well, that if you're a Linux person, that you would be able to answer that on your own, but I believe all of those are supported. So I know XFS, ButterFS, and I'm pretty sure the other two are, but I don't have a specific recommendation. Richie asks, good question. What about Active Directory? I changed your question a little bit. Yeah, Active Directory is a little bit different. We just did a webinar on best practices for AD. It's still back it all up for sure, image-based backup. But then, most of the restores on AD are going to be item level, so GPOs, user accounts, etc. Frank says, a thought. Can you set up Veeam with a backup restore of the files and access to a golden image to validate the files? Good question. Actually, I would just back up your templates with Veeam, Frank, and have that with a long retention. So I think I like where you're going with it, but I would actually back up the templates and call that the golden image. He clarified what I meant about Robinhood. I'm recommending that your backup files encrypt with Veeam, like the good encryption. Okay, that's what I'm recommending, because if they go up and exploited through Robinhood or something like that, I don't want to go on Dropbox and find a customer's, well, Dropbox is a bad example, but to find on some public website somebody's VBKs. So when I say encrypt, I meant Veeam encrypted backups. Ned talks about the keys in Veeam. That is in Enterprise Manager, as you identify, but there is a lost credential mechanism that you could check out. But I would also think about potentially making a parallel Veeam implementation, protecting the Veeam implementation, or using a config backup. Again, multiple copies, multiple ways out of a problem. Darren, oh hey Darren, nice to see you again. Yes, immutable backups are only available in AWS currently. We're working with Microsoft on it. They have container level immutability, which is a little bit too strong. And they also have Azure Blob Soft Delete, which is a little bit different, right? So we're working on that, but currently the immutability is for public S3 and certain S3 compatibles. Eric asking about a different cloud. Unfortunately, Eric, that's not one that we support currently. Ned's question is real similar to Darren. Let's see here. Edrisa, your question about data ready to activate later. Good question. That's why I recommend a secure restore, so we can kind of detect if the content is safe to restore. Sergio, any on-prem recommendations? We have a bunch of that in the forums. So if you look at the forums, there's probably a list of the S3 compatible um, that we have validated, or you can get with your sales team. There's an internal list that we have. Now, we're not selling the on-prem S3 storage. We just have the ones that are Veeam verified. Scott, should I keep the proxy servers off the internet? Yeah, I think so. It's a great idea, actually. Brian asks, is it fairly easy to set up encryption on a local NAS and then to a remote NAS through the backup copy job? Yes, if you can handle a checkbox, you got it, Brian. Easy peasy. Rustin asks, what about encryption if you're using deduplication? I will say that is a storage efficiency that would go away, but honestly, given the risk of data, I would have to take it. Okay, this will be our last question. We're close to time, and hopefully everyone's found this helpful. But Scott's question, what about retention lock on data domains? Is that an immutable option? Well, that's a good question, Scott. Now, I don't believe with data domain boost, which we do support, I don't think I can write in something and do the retention lock. But if you could grab a hold of the share in the data domain administration panel and do it, you could, but I don't think that's exposed through boost. I'd have to check the documentation. Whew. Thank you, David. All right, everyone. Well, we are out of time. Again, this webinar has been recorded. You can hit me on Twitter with any questions or just rick.vanover@veeam.com. I'll talk to anybody. On behalf of Natalie, who helped me out with the questions today, thank you, Natalie, and the global Veeam team, I'd like to thank you all for attending today. And that concludes today's featured webinar.